Really delighted that we've got two fantastic speakers this morning who's going to share their thoughts today. So we've got, I meant to kind of join a bit earlier. I hope I get your pronunciation of your names right. Dr. Kathi Kaesehage?
Yeah, that's
yep.
correct.
Brilliant, thank you. Who's a lecturer in climate change and business strategy at the University of Edinburgh. Welcome, thank you for joining us. We've also got Clare Wharmby, who's the innovation manager at the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation. I know you've been around for some time and done some fantastic work, so really looking forward to you sharing your views with us. And I guess in a way, you know, with COVID and Brexit kind of re-emerging as an issue, this, you know, the really important issue of climate change has slightly dropped off the radar, and yet it's really, really important that you know, businesses play their part. And I guess with Scottish Government, their economic recovery strategy is very much around inclusion, fair work and net zero carbon. I think there's a recognition that businesses have to step up, and these issues have to be part of the recovery plan, part of everyday business. They're not something that should be a second thought. These things should be embedded in our recovery plans and our business plans. But that's easier said than done at the moment. I think businesses do have some existential challenges, and it's very, very hard to see how they can put full attention to this. That said, the call that I was on earlier, we had Scotland IS on the call saying that tech businesses are extremely resilient. 82% of them are optimistic for growth. 73% are still hiring. And their biggest challenge at the moment is talent. So I think, you know, there's some optimism in the business sector that it's not all doom and gloom, and there are some sectors doing very well. And I was chatting earlier to Kevin about the Royal Bank of Scotland's economic update yesterday, and I was very surprised how resilient Edinburgh is in the graph. I had expected it to be pretty low down, but it's actually pretty much up there as one of the most resilient cities in Scotland at the moment. And I think that's largely due to strong financial services, fintech, tech, bioscience. But I think taking an average probably masks the real position, you know, this polarization between that, you know, the successful end of the spectrum, but the devastating impact that hospitality and tourism is facing. So I think, you know, what we really need is a bit of a roadmap, some good ideas and some solutions to help businesses engage and get on the bus with this. So I think, you know, very keen to hear from our speakers, and also pointing out that Edinburgh has set itself one of the biggest challenges. I think it's set to be net zero carbon by 2030. That's 9 years away. So it'd be interesting, with COVID likely to be impacting us till about 2022, 23, we're going to have to accelerate at a rate to hit that target. So as always, the format is that I will hand over to our speakers. We'll hear their thoughts, their presentations, and then there'll be an opportunity at the end for some questions. If you don't have a question, but you just want to share an experience or an opinion, please step in. We'll bring you in. I think Rebecca can unmute you, and it would be good to hear what you've got to say as well. So I'm going to stop there, and if I can hand over to Kathi first.
Yeah, good morning. Good to see everybody, and thanks a lot for this opportunity to share some of our thoughts. Yes, I'm Kathi. I'm a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh Business School. I'm also the Director of Research at the Centre for Business Climate Change and Sustainability. And at the moment, I am calling you from Germany because I am away for research. And normally you would be seeing me maybe from the Galapagos, Colombia and Mexico right now, but all of that has been cancelled. So I am just in Germany working from here on my research. So today I'm going to share my screen with you. Let's see if that works. Okay, I hope you can see that. Okay, wonderful. So I was tasked with speaking about how businesses in Edinburgh can lower their emissions. And Claire is going to be a little bit more practical. She has some really interesting insights. So I thought, what am I going to do? And I always like presentations or discussions where I can basically go away and do something practical about it. And so that's how I thought about this presentation. So I was going to talk today about why we're actually concerned with climate change, and how can I as a business think about climate change in the missions more as in a segmented strategic way. So once we hang up, I hope that you can go through 4 different aspects within your business and think about maybe what are aspects of your business that might be impacted. And the reason I want to do that is because thinking about the climate change challenge here that's listed on the left is that climate change is a really big physical phenomenon that actually impacts us in so many different ways, and not just in a physical way. And scientists have basically discovered that our behavior creates climate change, but climate change, because it's already taking place, is going to impact us in so many different ways. So we talk about the systematic transformational change that occurs just because the environment around us is changing. Now, if we think about something that changes our behavior, the way we run our business, the way we think about products, the way we consume, then, well, we've seen that before. We've seen transformational changes before. So we've seen something that we call globalization. We've seen how the internet is taking charge of our behavior, but we've also seen, for example, something that's more new and more recent is the sharing economy. So think going away from property and owning things, and for example, sharing cars, which is a big deal in Germany and Denmark, or using even Spotify. So thinking not, I need to own a resource, I can share a resource, I can just pay money to access something. So if we think about transformational change, then my question to you would be now, well, does that mean that systematic transformational change due to climate change is good or bad? So is it just this negative thing, or is it a good thing as well? And I know that's a controversial question, because normally we just want to think of climate change as being something bad. But I want to challenge you to think about it perhaps in a more systematic, strategic way. So if we look in traditional economic textbooks, then what we see when we think about the environment, we think about emissions and climate change, then it comes up as this discussion that either you're going to win-win, so you're going to have a win-win outcome. So it's something good for the environment. If I protect the environment, it's going to be something good for me, or it's going to be good for the environment, it's going to be bad for your business. So it's always this classification of comparing costs against benefits. So I'll just give you 2 examples of that. So if we think about a win-lose perspective, so if I invest in the environment, then traditionally we think, well, that's going to be bad for my business, because I have to invest money, I have to invest time and my staff, so my resources. But not always does that change my performance. So for example, if I'm forced due to the European Union, for example, or UK law to use more different types of fertilizer, for example, if I'm a farming business, then sometimes that doesn't change my performance. It only creates more cost for me, because these certain types of fertilizer are more costly. So then I think, well, that's just a win-lose perspective. It's good for the environment, but actually doesn't change anything for me. So in this kind of graph that you see here, the more I protect the environment, the less economic growth I have for myself. But then we also have the other perspective that perhaps some of you have experienced already, is a win-win perspective. So if I invest in the environment, for example, I change all my light bulbs to energy-saving light bulbs, then often I get rid of inefficiency. So I save some money, I save in this case electricity, and in the end I save money. So the more I protect the environment, the more economic growth I have. So that's kind of the perspective here that we want to see more often. So we want to increase our reputation through these kind of changes. We want to get rid of inefficiencies, and we want to lower our emissions all at the same time. So then my question for you is, well, which of these perspectives is more right? So are we more likely to end up in a win-win situation, or are we more likely to end up in a win-lose situation? Well, hopefully in this really short presentation, we can find a way where we can achieve more of the win-win situation and less of the win-lose situation. But just as a reminder, of course, cost investments are almost always involved. It's just about getting more of the investments back than you would lose. And one way of thinking about it is this big economic, or this big socioeconomic thing that's occurring around us, which we call climate change, impact so many different things in our business and also in my individual life. So one way to think about it or to segment it is to say, well, which aspects does climate change impact in my business? So it impacts the market around me. It impacts the social expectations of people. It impacts the regulation, so everything that I have to do and that I'm expected to do from the government and from any kind of agreement. And then it also impacts my resources. And all of that, all these four aspects should determine what you do about climate change and how you think about lowering your emissions. So just to give you an idea of what I'm actually talking about. So if I'm talking about that, the first aspect, regulation. So then we have traditionally command and control regulations. So things that you just have to follow because it's the law. We have market-based instruments. So if you're a bigger business, it's not relevant. For smaller businesses is the EU emissions trading scheme, but also other things like using, for example, different kinds of fertilizer, different kinds of materials. So things that you are incentivized to do, but you don't have to do, but it's good for you because in the end you save money. So for example, a bottle deposit scheme where you bring back the bottles, but you don't actually have to. And then on the last on the bottom, we've got this new trend of voluntary approaches. So where businesses come together in networks, can be small or big businesses, and they agree that they want to do something differently. And then you're not held accountable by the government, but sometimes the government becomes part of these voluntary approaches. And they're quite trendy and they're quite popular. So it's always worth thinking about what's going on around you and do you want to join any of these agreements. So that was regulation, but then we also have resources. So resources are really important and sometimes they get forgotten about. So it's that thing that you really, really need to actually run your business. So what you need and what's really unique to your business. But what is also unique about resources is that in the climate change discussion, we remember that they're all tied together. So resources don't just come to my business, but resources depend on other companies to make sure that they come to my business. And that's where the difficulty comes in. So if suddenly a drought or significant floods occur, someone is not able to deliver your resources, then that's really negative for your company. But also it can be less physical, can be more, for example, the wood industry might be hit by really strict regulations, and then the resources have to change as well. So it's really important to check your supply chain and see which resources might in the near future, in the next 3 to 5 years, really be impacted by different kinds of ideas, so that your resources might be more tricky to be accessed. And then the third driver would be market drivers. So it's more tangible. So you think, what about my competitors? So it's a bit abstract, a bit theoretical, but it's something that Michael Porter always talks about in his economic textbooks, where he says, well, if I'm a business, regardless if I'm small or big, I have to think about what my competitors are up to and how easy it is for another business, for example, in Edinburgh, to substitute my products or to supply something different that I really, really like to provide to my buyers, or how do my suppliers that I need, how much do I rely on them? So it's a good idea to go through these different things to think about competition in the market and how climate change changes that. So think about the demand that people have from you and the supply that you need as well. And then the last thing that is really trendy at the moment is also another driver, which we sometimes forget about, is the social drivers. So these kinds of ideas of what do people believe, what do they value, and what are their interests. And that's really come to the fore in the last 2 years, that people become more aware that, for example, they're going away from meat products to more sustainable products that are not animal-based, for example. Not because they believe animals should be protected, but often because they think it's relevant for the environment. So it's a new development and it's something that we need to pay attention to. So just before I wrap up, I wanted to give you a heads up, which is a really good example of why this is relevant and what I'm just all mentioning. And hopefully you can go away and have a good discussion with your colleagues, because it's one of my most interesting or one of my most inspiring cases. So you might remember a few years ago that Volkswagen was in a big crisis because of the emissions that they were producing in their new cars. So just to give you a reminder, what happened is that in 2015, Volkswagen was being caught that they were producing and selling cars in the USA that didn't meet the regulations that the engines should have. So the engines had a lot higher nitrogen emissions than they should have had. So I can see on next slide, it was actually 40 times higher than they displayed and that they were allowed to have. So the way they did that is not that it's basically that the technology that showed the emissions in the cars, that the software was basically manipulated. So the software was lying, and that was discovered. So for a big concern, for a big company, which none of us are Volkswagen, but for Volkswagen that meant that they all broke down and the stock price fell and the CEO had to resign. And in the end, they were charged with criminal charges, and they had to pay a lot of money. So, but why am I bringing up this example if we're not Volkswagen? Well, it's an interesting example because in the end, people were asking about why did this happen? Why, if a really reputable company like Volkswagen from Germany, who are known to do things right, how would they end up cheating and selling cars that are a lot dirtier than they should be? Well, the easy answer that happened was that, well, the engineers just didn't know what they were doing, and so it's the engineers' fault. So they produced engines that weren't needed. But if you really think about it, then you think, well, engineers are not the decision makers of a big company like Volkswagen. So what actually happened? And now I'm coming back to my 4 drivers for your companies, is that if you think about the regulation, what happened with Volkswagen is that actually Volkswagen was only looking towards the regulation in Germany, and they weren't paying attention to what was happening to the regulation in the USA. And actually in the USA, regulation was ahead of the German market in terms of the car industry. So having your eyes on a different market, but then selling your cars in the USA, the company wasn't really ready. So they kind of missed out on what was going on in the regulation, and they found themselves being caught to meet the regulation really quickly, but not being ready to do so. And at the same time, the stakeholders like the trade union, different agreements, really had the interest to push the company having more success in the USA, so in the American market. So the regulation aspect became really important for Volkswagen, but they just ended up neglecting that. And what happened as well, if you neglect those regulation needs, is that you don't have the resources that you need to meet those regulations. So in terms of resources, it was really the know-how and the technology that wasn't ready. So the engineers didn't have the know-how to create those engines on time, and they hadn't invested enough, and they basically just needed a few more years to get the resources ready. So Volkswagen had forgotten to put their eyes really on the resource market and to see how can I navigate the regulation, the resources to make that on time. And at the same time, they're really driven by the market demands that are going on around them. So people were demanding clean cars. The market was needing Volkswagen to really step up and sell cars in the States, but then at the same time, Volkswagen wasn't ready to meet that international competition. So that's a good example to really realize how some aspects of market resource regulation and social aspects can be brought together under climate change, but also can sometimes be in opposition to each other. So just because a company wants to create a profit, you still have to be really close, pay really close attention to what's going on for all these different 4 aspects due to climate change. So I think it's really interesting. It's a really interesting case, and it reminds us that we need to navigate all aspects, market, resource, regulation, and also those social things that are much more tangible when we enter in this climate change discussion. So hopefully what this presentation shows you or reminds us to do is to go through all 4 aspects to get ready for lowering our emissions.
Thanks very much, Kathi. So my screen was going all over the place then. Actually, that was really, really interesting. We as businesses, we feel there's this moral imperative, or many businesses feel there's a moral imperative to address climate change, but you know, an economic benefit doesn't, and a moral imperative doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. So I think you know, the 2 work hand in hand, and looking at it in terms of our supply chain and our business model, and making sure that we could use it to our advantage to give us that competitive edge. I think there's sort of lots of different ways of looking at this. I'm going to hand over to Clare now to hear your view, and then we'll open it up for some questions. I think there's a few coming in the chat as we speak. Anyway, over to Claire. Thanks very much, Claire.
So my name's Claire Wharmby. I am the Innovation Manager at the ECCI, and I'm going to talk about probably the kind of quite territorial local situation in Edinburgh, about what we're trying to do within the city, what the footprint looks like, and where businesses and the private sector might fit into that, and how hopefully we can help each other deliver some serious reductions, which is what we need to do. As Liz mentioned, the City of Edinburgh Council has set a net zero target by 2030. We are developing the net zero target boundary, and part of the reason why this is taking us quite a long time to work out exactly how to do this is because it's very complicated. This is based on a kind of territorial boundary, so we're looking at the edges of the City of Edinburgh as a local authority region, but the emission sources within that are quite complicated. This is work's been done and funded as part of an EU climate kick project called Healthy Clean Cities. So we've got some resources of design partners and ourselves as a partner of the ECCI and with the City of Edinburgh Council to try and sort, really my role is to kind of sort out the data side of things. So what we have is that the boundary we're trying to make sure that we are including the significant sources for the city, so that we're capturing what is actually important. We're trying to make sure that we're using data sets that are actually available, that the government produces, that can be audited, and also that are consistent with other organisations who are setting net zero targets in Scotland. And meeting those three requirements is proving to be quite difficult. However we cut this cake and however we draw this boundary, the approximate size of the problem is going to be around 2.5 million tonnes of carbon annually. Probably a wee bit more than that once we add in a few little minor sources. We do think that we've captured all of the kind of major sources at the moment, and this is what the problem in Edinburgh looks like. So this is a graph that shows activity. So what we're looking at here is not so much what the emission source is based on, so not whether it's electricity or gas or diesel or petrol, but what we're looking at is what we're actually using the emission source for. So we've divided it into heat, which makes up a huge part of the emissions, power, which is for equipment, lighting, so basically electricity use. Some of the heat here is also produced by electricity, particularly in the domestic sector, but we've counted it as heat. And then we've got freight and travel. So freight is light goods vehicles, heavy goods vehicles. Travel is private cars, buses, rail. The vast majority of these travel and fleet is road transport. So whatever we do to the data sets within the boundary, and we're going to be probably kind of tweaking them for, I'd say, several months to come, our problems really lie in, we have to decarbonise heat and the delivery of heat in buildings. So this is domestic, commercial and public. We have a huge amount of site on the domestic use of gas. So we can get down to kind of postcode level data on domestic use of gas. Everything else that's non-domestic in the City of Edinburgh is given to us as a kind of lump sum. And we have to try and artificially break that lump sum down into, is this used commercially? Is this used by public sector? Is this used in office buildings? Is it used in, it's quite a difficult job. Most of this heat is coming from natural gas. We think that there is little chance of decarbonisation of this fuel source in the short to medium term. There are possibilities in the future about using hydrogen, about putting biogas into the grid. The gas grid is decarbonising very slowly from biogas. But generally speaking, this is a really intractable problem. And the other thing is that it's based on quite seriously embedded infrastructure. So where in the domestic sector and in the commercial sector and public buildings, we've got gas boilers or we've got gas CHPs, those are quite expensive and difficult kit to sort of switch over. It's not a simple matter of kind of moving over. There are other options around heat, which we'll talk about in a wee while. The travel and freight sector, this is mostly diesel and petrol at the moment. Private cars, LGV, HGV. Private cars makes up a huge amount of this. Again, we're stuck with quite a lot of embedded infrastructure here. So we've got an awful lot of people own cars. Once you own a car, it's incredibly difficult to persuade yourself to use public transport because you've already invested the money in a car and you've got the running costs of the car. so that those don't diminish when you start to use public transport. Active travel is a different option. We have got fuel switch options within this sector, so we can switch to electric, but really we're not looking for a like-for-like traffic replacement. We don't want a like-for-like traffic replacement, because what that will do is embed us into a further structural kind of system that we don't particularly want. We would like less traffic, we would like more space for other road users. Active travel, we would like to have parking spaces released up for other activities within the city centre. So what we're looking for here is a kind of a combination of modal shifts of electric where there's no other alternative, but thinking about what the other alternatives are. Can we deliver goods in a different way? Can we do last mile solutions that can reduce congestion in the city centre? Can we get some of the benefits that Kathi was talking about in terms of the benefits to businesses, the benefits to individuals, the health benefits, the enormous air quality benefits that could be reached by reducing the amount of both diesel and petrol vehicles, but also the amount of traffic we've got generally. And the final sector is power use. And here, the situation is slightly different strategically. We've got a decarbonising grid. I'm going to show you later on what the grid is looking like at the moment and where it might go to. So it's a dangerous assumption to think that we're going to decarbonise at the rate that we're decarbonising at the moment. In the power use, it's not free. Renewable electricity is not free. There's a huge amount of carbon embodied that goes into the infrastructure of developing renewable energy. And there's going to be future demands on that on the electricity quantity. So that if we move into a kind of decarbonised electric transport system and thinking about using electricity for heat generation, we're going to have to think about the demand management of that and hopefully reduce the demand that we're making on at the moment. It's also a huge area of growth. Is one of the things that we've realised as we build new buildings in the city is that we are relatively constant on the use of heat. We've kind of managed, we can build a new building and use slightly less heat than the previous building, but we nearly always use more electricity, because when you build a new building, we put in upgraded lighting, we put upgraded equipment in, we put more equipment in. Every time we build a new school at the moment, it's filled with more and more energy using kit. So we need to start thinking about how we manage that demand in the future. This is where it gets a bit kind of carbon geeky, but we're talking about, when we're talking to organisations, for example, businesses like yourselves, what we're doing is we're kind of switching between types of boundaries. So with the city, we were looking at a territorial boundary. And these are known point sources of, we think they're probably CHPs that we've identified through the public data sets. This is a city boundary as a territorial boundary, but we might have organisational A, which is, for example, has an office in Edinburgh towards the end. A number of employees are travelling to it. Some of them are coming from inside the city, some of them are coming from outside the city, but most of their operations are global. So in actual fact, the territorial matchup of the emissions that are in the City of Edinburgh is relatively small. It's a small office, but this could be an enormously powerful global reaching organisation. We might have another organisation that is operating mainly within the city, and they've got their offices in the city, most of their staff travel from inside the city to their office, but their client base might be elsewhere. So some of their key influence about how they change the way that we do things could be well outside the city boundary. And we've also got Organisation C, which might produce goods which are transported through and consumed and disposed in the city. At the moment, we're looking at kind of a scope 1, scope 2, and a little bit of scope 3 territorial boundary. We haven't really thought in the city about the movement of goods and services, and how when, for example, if we're buying computer equipment from China, we're not including the embodied emissions of that computer equipment production and transport in the city's territorial boundary. So we know that there's going to be lots of things where organisations' emissions coincide with the city's emissions. As you reduce your emissions, you will also be reducing the territorial emissions of the city. But there isn't a 100% matchup by any means. There is a lot of double counting, undercounting, overcounting, all sorts of things. And as long as we understand that we're all trying to kind of, this is a big cake and we're all cutting it in different ways and dealing with different types of slices of it. And that's absolutely fine as long as we are dealing with the types of slices. Eventually we'll get to where we want to get to. we have very little sight on this at the moment. Okay, one of the things that we're talking about with the City of Edinburgh and its partners is that we need to start thinking about getting the sight of what individual organisations within the city, what their missions are within the city and what they're doing about them. And that is at the moment a very difficult problem to crack, is that data flow of private organisations, public organisations and individuals to say, you know, here's our share of the problem, here's what we're doing about it. So generally speaking, kind of organisations, when they're thinking about their organisational footprint, they think about a boundary that covers scope 1 emissions, so generation of heat, transport of using their fleet. They usually think about scope 2, which is generally generation of purchased electricity, and often things like business travel, waste generation and transmission distribution losses. So this is a kind of typical kind of organisational footprint. And this is a really important thing, that when people are setting a target to say, right, this is what we're setting the target on, but we also need to be really clear and honest with ourselves about what other emissions there are. So for example, procurement and understanding the supply chain emissions in purchased goods and services is starting to become more and more important. Because as we realise that we can manage the emissions within our own boundary, we need to think about how do we influence our supply chain. And Kathi said the same point, that we need to think about, right, how do we make sure that what we're buying is also contributing to a lower carbon future. Capital goods is the same thing. Upstream leased assets, a lot of the time, organisations are not the owner of a building. They might be using the building, they might be leasing the building from another, from someone. They might have a management company that manages the building, but the owner is somewhere else. And actually influencing and managing that upstream leased asset, and how do we get offices, how do we make offices retrofit down to zero carbon if we don't own the stock? How do we influence that market? And how do we talk to landlords and say, look, what we're looking for in the future is a zero carbon building. How are you going to get there? Employee commuting is often excluded from this boundary, but it's starting to become more and more crucial. And even more important to that is employee home working. At the moment, we're in the situation of really, in our mind, what we're all thinking is, what is an office? What does an office do? What is the office there for? And if our offices are actually distributed around 1,000 homes in the city, then if we see a reduction in our emissions, is that a genuine reduction in emissions, or is that just a leakage out of our boundary into employee home situation? Previously, this wasn't particularly important. People thought it's relatively minor, we don't need to capture it, it's a really difficult data set to go after. But I think that post-COVID, this might start to be a really key way that organisations are producing emissions and can influence them. And probably one of the things that we're kind of, again, this is going to really we're going to see this more and more often, is the impact of sold products. And when I'm talking about sold products, I'm not just talking about, for example, a brewery that produces beer and sells it and a consumer buys it. When we're thinking about sold products, if you're an organisation, for example, a large consultancy that does work with clients, your sold product is consultancy. So do you have sight on what the cost is of you delivering a piece of work for a client? It's probably quite possible to do, because if you've got a project management system that collates person hours and costs against that project, you can probably think about the carbon associated with it. But then also, are we influencing those clients to deliver the best possible outcome? In the City of Edinburgh, we're currently trying to work out how fast we need to run to meet this target. And how fast we need to run is how fast would our emissions be climbing anyway? Everywhere that we look in the city, we're building new houses, we're building new offices, we're building new infrastructure. Those are all adding to the footprint of the city. So every time that we kind of offer advice to clients, or that we build infrastructure ourselves, it's kind of like, what's that infrastructure going to do? Are we building a problem that we're going to have to solve within 10 years? There's lots of options here. Generation of heat, moving into air source heat pumps, renewable heat, district heating schemes. It's expensive, intractable. There are lots of no regrets options around this though. In insulation, in fabric of the building, it's often expensive. It is sometimes difficult to do, but we've got an opportunity at the moment that we're probably not in the buildings, and this is an opportunity to go in and say, right, what could we do that's relatively low cost, not particularly glamorous, but that will reduce heat losses. There is very, very little no regrets action around insulation and building fabric, we think. There's also the opportunity to use insulation materials that actually embody carbon. So carbon storage materials like hemp insulation can be used, which essentially kind of like stash carbon in the building itself. Leased assets. Do you have a policy within your company that says, right, what is our program for talking to our landlord or our building manager and saying, right, what are we going to do about this building? How is this going to become zero carbon? If the landlord isn't going to be prepared to retrofit the building or think about how to reduce the emissions of the building, what is our option for breaking that lease and finding another building within the city that will offer the kind of the zero carbon that we want? Can we steer that market? If enough people are asking landlords to build zero carbon buildings, we will start to build zero carbon buildings. At the moment, the market's not being driven by that, but that's because we need to make it explicit what we want. Home working, again, this is a challenging data set. We are thinking about how to capture this and how to work with this, but it's going to become important. In the same way that we offer bike to work schemes for people, what about offering solar panels at home schemes for people, or funding for insulation schemes for people? There's a lot of schemes already out there that are funded by the government, but reducing the barrier and the cost to kind of reduce to lowering people's home emissions can also have a massive impact on the city's footprint. And options for business travel, thinking about, do you have in your building, have you put in charging points if you own the car park? Have you talked to the landlord if you don't own the car park? Have you converted your fleet vehicles to electric vehicles if possible? Have you thought about reducing the amount of fleet you have, improving the logistics of the fleet, thinking about the future of, like, do we need to move things around? Do we need to move people around? And the impact of sold products is kind of where is our biggest sphere of influence in terms of what we do? And often that's around this kind of, what do we produce? What is our good and service that our business produces? And how do we make that sustainable? How do we help our clients downstream to be sustainable through the way that we deliver our services? Just very quickly, why we shouldn't rely on the grid to bail us out. Okay, this is the grid mix at the moment, going to 2019. And what you can see of the red line, this is the grid intensity. So this is how many units of carbon dioxide there are, carbon dioxide equivalent, for every kilowatt hour that we produce. What you can see here is that this carbon intensity has tracked the amount of coal in the grid. And we are running out of coal, which is great. We've basically eliminated coal. We're pretty much down, you know, at the trail end of what coal will do. So what we have to ask ourselves is, where are we going to get the reductions from in the future? And we are producing more wind and solar, but we're not kind of making inroads on this gas. And the combined gas turbine grid electricity kind of baseload, this is what we balance the grid with, this is what we make the grid work with. We're not actually making inroads into this. So in the near future, we can see that we've kind of dropped up, the rate of reduction has dropped off, and we're going to probably kind of bottom out in the next couple of years at around about 0.2 kilograms per kilowatt hour, which is roughly what natural gas is. So unless we can make serious inroads in using all of this wind and solar incredibly effectively, storing electricity in batteries, finding out different ways to balance the grid, of which batteries are one option, we're not going to get down to this kind of like mythical zero carbon electricity grid in the near future. So we have to think about that in our strategies. And finally, emissions reporting and targets are there to keep us honest. This is two of my favourite quotes from Richard Feynman, who is my favourite physicist, is that first principle is, you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. We have, for the last 5 years, in a lot of organisations that I've worked with, fundamentally been possibly fooling ourselves about our emissions reductions. So a lot of organisations are saying, you know, we set a target and we're halfway there, or we're 50% there, or we've exceeded our target. You need to make sure that your emissions, are they coming from changes to the accounting rules? So this is a bank error in your favour. Is it carbon leakage out of your boundary? Have you got rid of assets and then hired them back in, but set your boundary as only owned assets, in which case you've got carbon leakage. Your carbon is basically trickling out of your boundary, but it still exists. Or is it happening because of factors out with our control? A lot of organisations have made savings because the grid has decarbonised. We haven't reduced the amount of units we've used, we've just decarbonised the grid. And that is a genuine saving, but it's not something that we have done, and we haven't managed it actively. So you need to make sure that when you're reporting against your targets, are you making sure that you are reducing your consumption in areas that you are targeting to reduce it? Are you actively managing your footprint, or is your footprint actually managing you? And that's a really important thing to understand, because I think that we're about to move into the territory where it's going to get a lot harder, and we're going to have to really work at this and invest in this in ways that we haven't before, because we've just been riding the grid as it goes downwards. And this is, again, Richard Feynman, because he's awesome. For a successful technology, reality cannot take precedence over public relations, because nature can't be fooled. So if it's fine to say we are on target, we are on track, we have made a cut in our emissions, but you have to be absolutely honest with yourselves and potentially with other people that where has this cut come from? Is it coming because we're reducing our footprint boundary? Is it coming because we're letting carbon fall out of our boundary? Is it coming because we're using less intensive electricity sources? Or is it coming because we have actively targeted heat, travel, home working in our business, and we have made serious reductions? And that is where we start to win, and when we know we're winning. And that's me. I don't know if I kept to time, I'm sorry.
Brilliant. No, that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you very much to both our speakers. Really, really good presentations there. And Claire, particularly, I think seeing it laid out that way, that was, I think that's where businesses, or that's where we're kind of falling short, seeing it laid out where we're generating and how we approach it. I mean, and it also shows the complexity, but I can't help think about the conflicts as well. So, you know, at the moment we've got big issues with our city centre because people aren't commuting in. So we're worried that, are we going to have a city centre? What's happening to retail? What's happening to our businesses in the city centre? But at the same time, I know Arcade has produced a report earlier in the week about the well-being of communities, that we should be looking at a 15-minute commute. So that would, reduce the commute that people have to go into the city centre. Then I guess we're looking at transport, and I know in Edinburgh they've got a hierarchy of transport. So as you say, active travel, walking and cycling first, then public transport, more electric fleets, the tram extension, electric cars potentially in the city centre, and then poor old, petrol and diesel cars probably nowhere near. But again, we're displacing the issue. I noticed, during COVID, the city's full of these bollards as we're moving to wider pavements and cycle paths, so that they are encouraging this active travel. And I think the idea is sound, but I think the implementation has not been good. So I think communication is a big issue here. People don't know what they're for and how they can use them better. So I think there's a lot of challenges. Picking up your point about new build, I wonder whether Edinburgh Planning Department are implementing controls with the new build out of the west of Edinburgh. I think Parabola, when they're looking at their new housing and commercial stock, gas heating is not allowed. I think that they've, through the planning process, those policies are being put in place so that we are eradicating the gas heating there. So I think it was really clear, but it doesn't half throw up some sort of conflicts and the complexity of the challenge. And with 9 years to go, you're right. I think we all need to understand this better and how we play our part. Can I open up to some questions, please? I know there was a couple of chats on the go there. Does anybody want to come in? Dominic, do you want to come in? I see you've posted something on the chat.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was more agreeing with the point about incentivizing domestic, for example, solar generation or energy efficiencies in employees' homes. It feels like that would require or ought to have a government incentive or a tax incentive. If we're going to end up with a lot of home working, it's an obvious one. But that was more agreeing with the point. I did have a question, which was what the speaker's view was, for example, on offsetting mechanisms, but particularly local ones. For example, I know Brewdog have purchased some woodland or generating woodland. I mean, should Edinburgh businesses be partnering with the Borders and Dumfries and Galloway and trying to create new woodlands as an offsetting mechanism?
Kathi, do you want to?
Yeah, really good question. I think all of these initiatives are never perfect, but I think what Brewdog is doing, for example, is sets a really good example. And I think if we can, all of us, follow suit and do similar things, that would be a really good idea. We never quite know how these things play out and what else comes in. And, I think making such a decision that Brewdog did is a really good idea because it puts you ahead of before regulation comes in place. Because I do think there will be more regulation for SMEs specifically to offset emissions. So I think if we could follow suit, that would be a really good idea.
Thank you. Kevin, you've got a question there. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, so I popped a question on, just I suppose would be interested to know what are the carbon emissions of heating 350 homes versus one office block. But I suppose my real question actually is about motivation here. So thinking about how businesses are motivated to make change, what are the markets and investors saying about this? What about private equity and the institutional investors? Will there be is there an investment story here ultimately that makes the business worth more and higher returns? Interested on views around that.
I think this is probably, in that sense, it's probably a question for Kathi as well. But my experience at the moment is that nearly everybody, we ran a large event for Just Transition, which was talking to finance, so people like Scottish Widows, Loan Pensions Fund. All of them were, this is something that we need to think about, and also because what they are fundamentally interested in is reducing their risk. And if climate change presents an absolute risk to everybody, then the way to start mitigating that risk is to start thinking about the organisations that are conscious, aware of, and doing something about both their climate change impact and also climate change adaptation that they have planned. So I can't see that if investors aren't thinking about this and haven't captured this risk, then they're making a big mistake, frankly.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer in motivations and values. I think they're really important. But at the same time, I do believe that if we don't have to do certain things, we don't tend to do them that much. So I do think the investment story really starts with putting the right people into government and voting the right people. So I think that's really important. But there is an investment story at the moment. So, for example, one really big discussion is where do our pension schemes invest into? So right now we're discussing with the government is it mandatory for pension schemes to invest in certain green ideas, and how much do we regulate that? So I think it just gives an example of how important, and I don't think we will change our investment portfolios, for example, in our pension schemes, if we are not forced to do so, because the short win we tend to go to as humans, which psychology tells us. So I think it's tricky to initiative to create change if we don't put the right people in charge. But I do think as well that comes back to the individual story. So if we understand what we're living and what we're deciding and what we're standing in for, then I think we put the right people in charge and we change our systems. So I think we can look to different countries where we see that, like for example, Denmark, or we see certain changes in Germany as well. So I think it's really important, but I do think there's that bigger story that we just cannot get away from, that we need to have regulation to change the story.
Yeah, and if I look at it from the perspective of a bank and Royal Bank of Scotland, you know, we've made climate change a key part of our purpose, in that, you know, people, families and businesses can't thrive if the environment is not sustainable and the climate's not looked after. I suppose the question for us is, so how do we allocate our capital in a way that it is more beneficial to borrow if you are a business that has a positive impact on the environment versus one that perhaps is using more resources than it should, and that's a huge question in terms of how we positively incentivize certain businesses in a certain direction. But the challenge that we've got round about that, Claire, comes back to your very point, is where's the data? How do we know, other than using broad brush sectors and talking about oil and gas, how do you really boil that down? But I think we certainly recognise that we've started this thought process. And I'm on the Climate Change Transformation Programme with Edinburgh University, which so far is shaping up to be excellent, being about 2 weeks in now. But it's, at this point in time, throwing up more questions than answers, which I think is obviously what it's intended to do. And today's presentation has been excellent, just keeping that thought process going. But yeah, the lack of data and the need for data, Claire, as you've highlighted, is absolutely key to help people make the right decisions.
Thanks, Kevin. That's an interesting question, because I thought your response, Kathi, about politicians and potential intervention kind of reminds me that back, I think, sort of a couple of decades ago, when Silicon Valley and California were taken off, it was because the Californian government mandated that a certain percentage of pension funds had to be invested in technology companies. And it was that kind of political intervention of where the investments had to go that really drove their kind of emergence as the you know, leaders in technology, and why it's kind of so much is happening there. So I think that, you know, that's a really good point. We're of time, a couple of minutes. Pamela, I noticed that you put something in the chat. Do you want to come in, Pamela?
Yeah, hi. It was more just in terms of a comment. It's just interesting to see the emphasis on the supply chain by both speakers. We recently saw from the UK government the launching of a consultation, which is really quite a sort of groundbreaking, but I think possibly has gone a wee bit under the radar given the state of the general world at the moment. But as currently conceived, essentially, it's a consultation on introducing new laws around due diligence on certain ESG matters. And at the moment, that is focused on forest risk commodities. And it looks like this would impose a sort of duty on large businesses who use certain forest risk commodities to ensure that they're not sourced from any illegally cleared rainforests. And these businesses would be forced to publish their due diligence plans, report on their performance, and be exposed to sort of significant fines and penalties should they not do so. So it's really just this sort of comment that the focus on the supply chain is something that we're seeing really coming through now. And as far as I'm aware, in terms of kind of law at a UK level, this is a sort of first law or proposed law of its kind that's really really kind of drilling down into that. The commodities, just out of interest, at the moment that this due diligence will focus on, really kind of relevant to the food industries, things like beef, leather, cocoa, palm oil, pulp and paper, timber, rubber and soya. So these are the sorts of things that are consumed in really vast amounts throughout Scotland and indeed the rest of the UK. So it's just a sort of recognition of this, the importance of understanding your supply chain and how that is now looking like it's going to become firm law, as opposed to just something that possibly, you know, consumers would like to know a bit more about.
Thanks very much for that, Pamela. Good, really good comment. Dave, Gorman, very quickly before we wrap up, you have a comment about offsetting. Do you want to come in quickly?
Thanks, Liz. I'll be really quick. Morning, everybody. Yeah, I think on offsets, it's obviously a good thing to do, but as Claire says in the comments, our view is that you have to manage demand first. There isn't enough land if everybody offsets, is the thing to be aware of. There simply isn't enough land in the world if we all went for offsets. Offsets have to be high quality, they have to be additional, and they have to be long term. The key point for me, though, as well, is that they shouldn't be just about carbon. They need to be as much about ecology, and they need to be as much about community, and they need to be as much about rural development. Otherwise, there's a risk that it's a very market-based, casual, strange sort of, here I bought an offset from a man in the street. What you really want is long-term, additional, community-based, with a view to developing the economy, and those connections between maybe urban businesses and rural could be quite productive. But our view is, we're looking at this quite seriously, but our view is it will be long-term and it will be engaged. So that's the comment I want to make anyway. And fascinating presentation, thanks.
Thank you very much. We're just sadly out of time. We always find we could go on for a lot longer, and these Zooms are great that we can conveniently all get together, but it does stifle conversation and debate. But we've had two fantastic presentations. Thank you very much. And I really thought that kind of boundary of the city and the challenges of how we manage the city and don't just displace and push the issue out. I suppose we've also got the to address the issue that it's not just about cities anymore, it's about regions. We are viewing economies as regions, and therefore there's going to have to be a lot of collaboration about houses that are in the region outside the city and the transport routes and where the jobs are and where the housing are, and are we now changing the way we work so that we are less office based. So I think we've all got lots to think about, but two great presentations to take away. Thank you very much for attending today. As you see, there's more questions than answers. As Kevin raised, I think data is key to this. We need to kind of focus in on the data. Unfortunately, we've got some world-class resources here in Edinburgh around that. But thank you very much for attending this morning. Hope you all have a good day, and we'll see you again very soon. Thank you very much.